Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Rizzo, and I'm here to talk about the Cold War. This PowerPoint was both worked on by Alexis Cameron and myself. Alexis, he helped put in images and the slide animations. We both researched, and I'm the one narrating and recording the video. Alright, so what is the Cold War? So the Cold War was a period of intense rivalry between the United States and its allies against the Soviet Union and their allies. Note that the Soviet Union at this time is technically Russia and some other countries under the communist regime. It didn't really involve many conflicts. They did wage the so-called war with propaganda, weapon buildup, politics, and economics. It lasted from 1945 to 1991, and it spawned many events under this period that we will cover in this presentation. And this pointed earlier that this was caused because the rise of communist Russia, the Soviet Union or USSR, and the United States and its allies were very afraid of them because they saw communism as a threat and more of a dictatorship, while the United States fully supports freedom, so-called freedom it follows. Alright, so why don't we take a look at the causes? Well, one of the major defining causes, because it technically starts in 1945 when World War II ends and Hitler was defeated, so the truce between Russia and the USA is no longer active because they no longer have a common enemy, so they're back at being enemies themselves. The USSR, or Soviet Russia, adopted an intensive policy about expanding, and so they slowly moved across Europe, spreading communism. And the USSR, for this, they did this because they fear Germany rebuilding and striking back again. But there's also a flip side to this. The USA and Great Britain were also fearing Russia. There was this plan, the Marshall Plan from the USA, in which that they sent money and aid to these countries after World War II, but some of them eventually fell under communist control. The major point about this, Russia finally figures out nuclear war weapons. That's a big no-no. And then an underlying motive was like the USSR has a lot of resentment and grief over World War II since they did have the most fighting in it, and they really weren't respected in the world because they weren't seen as like national powers. Yeah, I mean, weren't seen like international powers like Great Britain and the USSA at this point. So the Iron Curtain speech. This speech was given by Churchill, in which he praised the USA, which he claimed was at the pinnacle of the world power. Though his purpose for it was in order to create a stronger relationship with Britain, and essentially a strong alliance for war affairs. And then he essentially warned of the Soviet Union expansion, the Iron Curtain, and communist forces that had descended around southern and northern Europe. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin portrayed this speech as warmongering, or in other words, just to stir up conflict. And then, like Stalin stated, the speech was soon seen as major influences to the beginning of the Cold War. And here we have Churchill speaking in Missouri, Fulton, Missouri. So he was flown out to the USA, in which he was invited to speak. The Berlin Wall. So, a little context about this. Berlin, the city in Germany, essentially was split down the middle between Russia and other European countries. I think it was Great Britain at the time. So the Berlin Wall stood up since from 1962 to 1989, and essentially East and West Berlin were created, and which is split between communists and anti-communists. Note that West Berlin was the one that was anti-communist and had a better life overall. So people started from escaping towards West Berlin from East Berlin, in which it hurt East Berlin, East Berlin, Berlin/Germany's stability, because they lost a whole bunch of good workers. And this war was essentially the real life embodiment of the Cold War, because it totally showcased the division holstered from the Cold War. It was eventually taken down in 1989. It may still be standing to this day, but like major parts and pieces of it were taken down, so you can access the rest of Berlin. Here we go. You can see more or less what the wall looks like in this corner image and how it's spanned all around here. Alright. Next up, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, taking place October 6, 1962, nearly a 2-week tension between the USSR and USA occurred. And these political comics may depict what might be happening. Essentially, the USSR sent missiles to Cuba for defensive measures, because at this point Cuba was freshly communist, in which the Castro brothers took over and overthrew the last government. Because Cuba is so near the USA soil, it threw off the USSA, so they also started putting up missiles near the USSR after doing some reconnaissance, in which they discovered by accident the missiles in Cuba. And this is where threats about nuclear warfare started rising. And essentially, it finally ended and concluded after the USA promised the USSR they won't attack or invade Cuba, and so essentially both sides withdrew their missiles from their locations, in which it ended it. Note, here is Cuba. Essentially, if you have missiles like nukes or atomic bombs that can essentially nearly reach anywhere in the US, I'm pretty sure, or probably even like up to around this area, that's a big no-no, and so that's why the US were quite afraid of the missiles being so close. Ooh, another event that spawned from this within the Cold War period was the Vietnam War. Known as the Second Indochina War, it's essentially an undeclared war in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, from November 1st, 1955 to the 30th of April, 1975. Essentially, it was fought between the Communist North Vietnam and Viet Cong against South Vietnam and the United States. Essentially, the North were communists and the South were not communists. So the US didn't want the expansion of the communists, so they decided to help out South Vietnam, in which it fully engulfed the war to start. However, due to the tensions in the US with the anti-war movement, they had to pull out, and so it caused the entire Vietnam to be taken over by communists. Huge death totals. 2 million Vietnamese were killed, 3 million were wounded, and another 12 million became refugees. And essentially Vietnam was in a pretty demolished state and condition. But reconstruction is slowly went by over time. Here you can see essentially the landscape of what was going down in Vietnam. You see helicopters, troopers going into the long grass fields. here's the forces, North Vietnam, this entire section, versus the South Vietnam. Effects are essentially year 1991, the war ends, and the Iron Curtain also ends. And essentially, it allowed 15 new nations to emerge from the Soviet Union, who were no longer communist. Some of them may be communist, but majority of them weren't anymore. And after the downfall, major economic liabilities left for the US and Russia. Russia suffered a recession, leaving many people poor again, as they were before they became the USSR. During this time, there was an arms race in which they just built up to see who could do the best weapons. It's essentially they were just flexing on each other to see who can do the best in terms of making the craziest weapons. So they mainly focused around nuclear weapons. They were never used, but they still exist to this day. But due to negotiations, such as the Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, these weapons were essentially banned. And then, additionally, there was another two agreements, SALT I and SALT II, which stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, agreed in limiting the number of missiles, artillery, and other weapons. And then finally, communism was successfully brought down. It died down. There you still got China, who's essentially like a mix of communism and socialism at this point. But communism still lives on to this day, no matter what people say. But essentially, the USSR is no longer the giant powerhouse that people feared. And here we can see essentially a map of Soviet Union, and essentially the territory that they claimed. Here you can see East Germany and then West Germany. So this is essentially where the Berlin Wall was. And so all these countries, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, essentially all these nations became what they became new nations after the fall of the Soviets. Here you can see it now. And here's our sources. I would like to say thank you for listening. Hope you guys were able to understand majority of this. Here's the sources that we used. If you want to further experience some more learning and research on the side. And I would say stay current. Let's see what's the next video going to be talking about.